time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to the same time. And at that time the people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. That's the book of remembrance, not the book of life. Those that remember God's truth, they're clinging to that truth, and they won't give it up. Now and God says, I will protect you. I will protect you individuals. If the nation doesn't repent, I'll protect the people that are obedient to me, that are delivering my message to the world.
Greetings, friends. Welcome to our YouTube channel, Book of Remembrance, where new revelation is being poured out to you right this very moment, just prior to the return of Jesus Christ to this earth in all power and glory. In our last episode, we began with our message titled, The King of the North and the King of the South Prophecy of Daniel the Prophet, Part 1. We mentioned that the Philadelphia Church of God had just purchased a Gulfstream 450 private jet in order for Pastor General Gerald Flurry to reach the world and its leaders more efficiently as prophesied in Revelation 10, verse 11. Thou must prophesy again before many peoples, nations, and tongues. However, we proved from the Bible that this verse is really referring to the ministry and members in God's church in this end time and not the world. Today, let's dive into the heart of our message given to Daniel the prophet by God about the King of the North and the King of the South mentioned in Daniel 11, verse 40. The King of the North and the King of the South. We have already proven that the kings being discussed in the book of Revelation are pertaining to the ministers and members in God's church. Does this apply also to other prophecies in the Bible, specifically to Daniel's prophecy concerning the King of the North and the King of the South? For many years, ministers in God's church built their knowledge of Bible prophecies from the research papers of a well-known WCG scholar named Dr. Herman Hay. It has become the basis of understanding Bible prophecies from which all the Church of God groups out there use to interpret biblical prophetic passages specifically concerning Daniel's prophecy. That same knowledge was the basis of Mr. Gerald Flurry's understanding concerning the prophecies in Daniel about the King of the North and the King of the South. From his booklet, The King of the South, Mr. Flurry even wrote, The King of the North and the King of the South are two powers prophesied to clash in this end time. So God's true church must know who they are. And at the time of the end shall the King of the South push at him, and the King of the North shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, and with horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. Daniel 11, verse 40. Both powers are rising fast on the world scene right now. This clash will shake the world as never before, and that is the good news. The bad news is that it will lead to World War III. Do you know the identity of these kings? It is critical that you do. I want to prove to you that Islamic extremism is the King of the South. You need this understanding. Moving on, the time of the end. Let's look at the expression, time of the end. The King of the North and the King of the South arise in the time of the end, in Daniel 11, verse 40. Daniel 12, verse 4 also mentions the time of the end. Notice Daniel 12, verse 9. And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. The phrase time of the end in these three verses comes from the same Hebrew words. Daniel 11:40 begins at the end time story flow that continues through chapter 12. Daniel 12, verse 1 discusses at that time. What time? The time of the end, spoken of in Daniel 11:40. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered. Every one shall be found written in the book. Daniel 12, verse 1. At that time there is unparalleled world cataclysm, and God's people are delivered from this great tribulation. So this is a now prophecy. Daniel 11, verse 40 tells us, the king of the south will push at the king of the north. When does this push occur? It must happen at the book of Daniel was revealed in this end time. After the book of Daniel was revealed at this end time. Daniel 12:9 tells us the time of the end began when Daniel was revealed. So the king of the south must arise after Daniel was revealed to God's end time church. To Herbert W. Armstrong. However, many of the specifics of Daniel's book have been revealed to the Philadelphia Church of God today. That was all from Mr. Fleury's book, The King of the South, pages 1 and 2. Has God really revealed many specifics of Daniel's book to the Philadelphia Church of God today? Let's continue with what Mr. Fleury wrote. Daniel 11 is the history and prophecy of the warring kings of the north and south. The time frame is just before the time of Christ's first coming to his second coming. However, we must remember that Daniel was written for our end time. So the time frame is focused on the end time. But now we have moved into the specific last end of Daniel 8:19 of the end time period. Now notice how deeply God's very elect are embedded and emphasized within the 11th and 12th chapters of Daniel. In Daniel 11, verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt with flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. The word exploits means heroic acts. The very elect stand firm and take action. Our 6-year court battle with the Worldwide Church of God over the right to print Herbert W. Armstrong's writings is an example. The Philadelphia Church of God won that battle when it looked like we had no chance of winning. God gave us the victory. Now the copyrights to Mr. Armstrong's writings belong to us. And that's page 68 of The King of the South. The logical question one might ask, what's the connection of Iran and Germany to God's church? Is there any? And if there is, can we prove it from the pages of the Bible? Now why does the supposed vision of Daniel chapter 11 of the ancient world powers jump abruptly going to the prophecy about God's church in this last end like the 6-year court battle with the WCG, as Mr. Fleury suggested in his booklet? There are several questions that would require clear-cut answers. For emphasis, Mr. Fleury noted that Daniel 11 is the history and prophecy of the warring kings of the north and south. But who were these kings really? Are they really Iran and Germany, being the king of the south and the king of the north, respectively? God has now given the full understanding of Daniel's prophecy in this last end, and you will experience the greatest shock of your life with his true vision of the history and prophecy of the kings of the north and south. We must deeply understand the context of this prophecy in Daniel before we can fully comprehend the entire story being told by God through his prophet, because in reality, it is actually his story. And in order to truly understand Daniel's prophecy, we need to see that context from where God began revealing the vision to Daniel concerning the time of the end. The most crucial point of the whole vision lies in Daniel chapter 8. We read in Daniel 8, verse 14, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. We should not look at any place else but the sanctuary, which is in this end time is referring to God's own church. We should not focus on the world scene as we have done in the past. Even Mr. Gerald Fleury noticed that this whole vision is really about God's church in the last end. This is what he said. The whole vision is about an evening and morning sacrifice in the temple. The temple today is God's church, Ephesians 2, verses 20 and 21. So the whole vision, as we shall see, is mainly about God's church. Daniel didn't understand this vision was giving him. God sent the archangel Gabriel to Daniel to explain verses 15 and 16. Understand, O Son of Man, Gabriel said, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. In verse 26 of chapter 8, Daniel writes, and the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told, is true. Therefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. Today we are right in the midst of it. This is happening in God's temple. This whole vision is about God's church right now, the last end. That was from Daniel Unsealed at Last, page 17 and page 30. The prophet Daniel even fainted and became sick for several days after God showed him this vision of the last end. Let us read Daniel 8, verse 27. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Again, it says in verse 27 that none understood it. No one, including the prophet Daniel. Yet look at the Bible commentaries, and they are in unison in declaring that Daniel's prophecy was all about world powers that will come out on the scene. It is also a common knowledge among God's people that it was so. But how can we connect those historical world powers to God's plan for mankind? It's really quite confusing, and we always ended up with so many speculations as we did in the past when we were in the Philadelphia Church of God. Yet when God finally reveals the prophecy in Daniel, or any prophecy, there is, through his perspective, everything else becomes irrefutably crystal clear. To begin with, the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel gives an outline of a prophecy concerning the sanctuary or God's church in this end time. We have already proven that in our articles, The Last End Vision of the Prophet Daniel, Part 1 and Part 2. You can find those on our website, lightofthegentiles.com. That is lightofthegentiles.com. Just refer to our archives section, and you will find Part 1 under August of 2016 and Part 2 in November 2016. That vision in Chapter 8 continues all the way through to Chapter 12, and it discusses in great detail the history and prophecy of God's church from the time of the physical rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem that led to the establishment of God's church by Jesus Christ in the Ephesian era up until the time of the transition of the Philadelphia era going to the Laodicean era. During the time of Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong, the WCG once wrote in a pamphlet that prophecy is history written in advance, which we will prove in considering one of Mr. Armstrong's prophecies concerning the time setting of the fulfillment of end-time Bible prophecies. In his February 7th, 1979 co-worker letter, he wrote an astounding statement that is now part of modern church history. And I quote, "The outrageous, unconstitutional invasion and captivity of the church and work of the living God continues. It is the very beginning of fulfillment of end-time Bible prophecies. This monstrous invasion of the state of California will go down in history for the next 1,000 years. I said in the beginning of this letter that this crisis is the very beginning of fulfillment of end-time prophecies. Now let me explain some amazing prophecies foretelling this very present battle. This present crisis is the very start of end-time prophesied events. It will culminate in the second coming of Jesus Christ in supreme power and glory to rule all nations 1,000 years and thereafter." That was from Mr. Armstrong's co-worker letter, February 7th, 1979. Those statements of Mr. Armstrong has been and will be proved correct and true through Daniel's prophecy. To begin with, let us first identify some important aspect of prophecy concerning the identities of characters being mentioned in the Bible. Knowing their identities is the key to understanding Bible prophecies in this last end. Several prophecies in the Bible are written discussing the cardinal points of the compass: the north, south, east, and the west. We can read of the famous king of the north and the king of the south, the king of the east. But what does each cardinal point represent in Bible prophecy? The Bible is replete with information that the north is a symbol of the heavenly abode of God where he sits on his throne. In Isaiah 14, verse 13, "For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of heaven. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north." Actually, the Almighty God is the true king of the north. Now, and if the north is a representation of God's sovereign rule, why is it that we can also read in the Bible something of an evil representation of the north? Just like what the prophet Daniel wrote, Jeremiah 1, verses 14 and 15. "Then the Lord said unto me, Out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. For lo, I will call all the families of the kingdoms of the north, saith the Lord, and they shall come, and they shall set everyone in his throne at the entering of the gates of Jerusalem, and against all the walls thereof round about, and against all the cities of Judah. The answer is quite simple. Let us take the example of the first world-ruling king, Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel chapter 4, verses 30 and 31, we read, "The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee." Why did God inspire these verses to be written in the Bible? Let's read Daniel 4:24, verses 24 and 25. "This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which is come upon my lord the king, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven. And 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomever he will." God wants everyone to know that he is the true king of the north, who rules in the kingdom of men. He is the one who gives the authority to whomever he finds will fulfill his will, and he saw fit in his plan whether that man whom he had given authority will do good or evil. It is his prerogative, and no man can question that. Now, if the north is a representation of God's rule among the kingdom of men, well, what can be said about the south? What does it represent? It's actually just the opposing force against the north, whereas the cardinal point of the south is just the opposite of the north. The cardinal point of south may be primarily a negative symbol. It is negative comparable to what can be found in the south of Israel, which is a wilderness, that is the Negev desert, a region found in the southern part of the land of Israel. It is a region described in the Bible as the land of trouble and anguish, as written in the book of Isaiah. We can read Isaiah 30, verse 6, "The burden of the beast of the south into the land of trouble and anguish." The south also was a symbol of slavery. That is, the south of Israel is Egypt, who enslaved the ancient nation of Israel for more than 400 years, as we can read in Exodus 1 through 14. Considering again the context of the prophecy in Daniel, which is about the sanctuary, or God's church, it just simply means that the king of the north would be the ruler who God has given the authority to rule among the people inside his own church, whereas the king of the south would be the opposing force to that king of the north. The king of the north in the Worldwide Church of God during the Philadelphia era was Herbert W. Armstrong, whereas his son, Carter X, was the king of the south. The 4 kings of compromise and ostentation. Let's start the history and prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. "Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia." Who are these 4 kings of Persia being mentioned in this prophecy? In one of our previous articles, we have already proven that Garner Ted Armstrong was the prophesied king of Media and Persia. And you can refer once again to our article, The Last End Vision of the Prophet Daniel, Part 1. For our review, though, let's go back to Daniel chapter 8. In verse 20, "The ram which thou sawest having horns is the king of Media and Persia." Media in the original Hebrew is Madai, H4074. In the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, it is defined as middle land. Middle land or middle ground in the dictionary means a position or set of opinions that is acceptable to many different people, or an area of compromise, or possible agreement between 2 extreme positions, especially political ones. Persia, in the original Hebrew, is Paras, P-A-R-A-S. In the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, it means splendid. Splendid in the dictionary can mean 1. Imposing by reason of showiness or grandeur, magnificent. 2. Admired by many, illustrious. And 3. Admirable for boldness. Showiness is synonymous to ostentatiousness, which means characterized by pretentious show and attempt to impress others. These two words, Media and Persia, is a description of the ram. The ram is being described as the king of compromise and ostentation. Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong has identified these 4 kings of Persia, or the 4 kings of compromise and ostentation, who stood up in the Worldwide Church of God, and he wrote about them on page 2 of the Good News September 1979 edition, entitled Christ Now Moves to Put God's Government Back on Track. The Church Administration Department was set up in Pasadena with Roderick C. Meredith administering the department. We read also by 1971, my son Garner Ted Armstrong had removed Mr. Meredith from that office, sent him to England as dean of the faculty, and installed David Antion as director of the ministry. This was a mistake, but not then recognized. It became apparent by 1974 that David Antion had gone too far. A conspiracy was growing among certain of the ministers to bolt the Church of God, or they hoped through David Antion and Albert Portune at headquarters to simply take over the Church of God. The conspiracy was thwarted, but Mr. Antion decided his loyalties were with the ministers, not the Apostle Christ had raised up and used in building the church. The ministerial revolt, however, resulted in some 35 ministers leaving the church and taking 2,000 to 3,000 members with them. Mr. Armstrong succeeded in persuading Mr. Antion to stay with the church. A small few of the revolters formed what they called the Associated Church of God, with headquarters in or near Washington, D.C. A few ministers took a portion of their local members with them, each forming his own little local church. However, it all came to naught. God was not in this revolt. God was in his church, and in a few months, God had added to his church more new members than the number who had went out. My son, Garner Ted, about this time began his own conspiracy to take over the church. And if his father did not oblige him by dying to put Herbert W. Armstrong into retirement, Ted brought 4 or 5 men in from the field of work on a peer basis with Wayne Cole in supervision over the ministry. After a period of time, Mr. Cole managed to eliminate the others. Mr. Cole managed to set himself up as the head of the ministry. All this was from the Good News magazine of September 1979. Here again is a list of the 4 kings of Media and Persia, the 4 kings of compromise and ostentation. And they are, number 1, David Antion. Number 2, Albert Portune. Number 3, Wayne Cole. Number 4, Garner Ted Armstrong. These 4 evangelists, ranked ministers in God's church, were actually directly involved in the infamous Systematic Theology Project, STP, of which Mr. Armstrong wrote an article entitled Recent History of the Philadelphia Era of the Worldwide Church of God in the Worldwide News in June of 1985, discussing this specific subject that was injected to the ministry around the world for the sole purpose of compromise with the doctrines of the church through ostentation. Here's what he wrote. It had become custom to hold an annual ministerial conference of ministers at Pasadena headquarters. In the 74 to 77 conferences, these meetings had been marred by controversies over doctrinal issues. Just before January 1978 conference, I was determined to prevent doctrinal controversy. I was also due to leave on another round-the-world trip. I had decided to postpone the trip until after the conference in order to keep controversy out of the conference. But the one to be left in charge of my absence urged me to remain for the opening morning session so that I could open the conference and keep my departure at 12 noon. And he gave me his word no doctrines would be discussed in the conference, only administrative matters. I agreed to this. I opened the conference, left immediately for the airport, had lunch on the plane. I was going first to Japan, then across the North Pole to Europe, and into Western Africa before returning to Pasadena. I had not gotten very far out over the Pacific Ocean that afternoon until the afternoon session of the conference. A voluminous printed work called the Systematic Theology Project, or STP for short, was distributed to the ministry with specific instructions that it was a definite outline of basic church doctrines, and no minister was to preach anything contrary to this treaty. I knew absolutely nothing of this STP, or that it had been in preparation. It had been carefully concealed from me. It was a flagrant violation of the promise made to induce me to leave so this doctrinal change in church teaching could be given to all ministers without my knowledge. I knew nothing of this STP in spite of claims made by others, until a copy was brought to me by some loyal ministers in late April or early May of 1978, when I then notified every minister in the world to return his copy immediately and ignore all its liberal doctrines and teachings. It had come to my attention that some of the liberals, no longer members of God's church, had claimed that I did know of this infamous STP project. That is positively not true. A few papers on one or two subjects which were not liberal had been brought to me in Tucson, Arizona, but no clear mention was made of the preparations underway for producing this STP project. None of the liberalized teachings in STP were shown to me or approved by me at any time. And this was written in the special edition of the 24th of June, 1985, Worldwide News. Now, according to the prophet Daniel, out of the four evangelists, he has prophesied that the fourth king will be far richer and stronger. To learn who this fourth king is that will be far richer and stronger, be sure to stay tuned to our next episode. Until then, goodbye, friends.